President Trump has won the battleground state of Florida.
The state of Minnesota has been projected to go in the Biden column.
This is a fraud. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election.
You're going to have to be patient. And it ain't over till every vote is counted.
The Associated Press has not called the presidential race at this point.
Good morning. I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post, clearly tired from last night's and this morning's events. You're watching First Look, Washington Post Live's one-stop shop for news and analysis. Let's just jump right on into it and go to the key person to talk to right now at the top of the show, and that is Chief National Correspondent and veteran political reporter and editor Dan Balz. Dan, just bring us up to speed. Bring us up to speed on where we are.
Well, we're waiting. That's where we are at this point. We're waiting for votes to be counted in a handful of states that are going to decide this election. Nobody has won this election at this point, despite claims by the president that he has won it. And so we're watching closely a few states. We're watching Michigan, we're watching Pennsylvania, we're watching Wisconsin. I think we knew probably in the end that we would be watching those three states today. We're also watching Georgia, which still has votes to come in. We're looking at Arizona, where former Vice President Biden has a lead. We're looking at Nevada, where he also has a very narrow lead. So we just have to wait and see how these things come through for either candidate.
So the situation we're in is exactly where at least I thought it would be, and where you thought it would be, in terms of we have to wait. The idea that we were going to get a winner on election night was a hoped-for dream that didn't come true. But one thing that happened around 2 o'clock this morning was that the President of the United States came out and essentially declared victory, and claimed victory in states that had not even been called. Is there any basis for the president's comments? Does he have any power to stop the count?
No and no. I mean, there's no basis for his claim that he's won this election. There are too many votes out. These states have not been called, either projected by news organizations, nor, more importantly, by the state officials who certify results. So his claim that he has already won is simply false. The other is he does not have the power to stop the counting. Now, there are likely to be legal challenges to some of these counts and some of these ballots, and I suspect Pennsylvania, depending on whether it gets significantly closer, could be one of those. But he said last night, we're going to go straight to the Supreme Court. There's no legal way to do that. That you don't take a case like this straight to the Supreme Court. You have to work your way through the system. So on all fronts, he was more than mistaken. He was simply blatantly wrong and frankly irresponsible, given the sort of the degree to which this country is on edge about the outcome of the election. I mean, this has turned out to be a closer election than many people, and certainly many of the polls had indicated. And so people are having to wait, and the president is trying to kind of throw gasoline on this right now.
But Dan, it's not so far-fetched that the Supreme Court could get involved. I mean, I'm thinking about 2000, when, the last time we went through a protracted period of not knowing who the president was. And, there were legal challenges, and they made their way all the way up to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court got involved and stopped the count in Florida. So are you saying that kind of expedited timetable isn't possible in this particular case this time around?
Well, I mean, Jonathan, for one, that was not an expedited timetable. I mean, that was a 36-day recount, but it began by the state law in Florida triggering an automatic recount, which then led to a series of legal battles, titanic legal battles. We are not at a point where any of these states is A, fully counted, and B, that I can tell within the range of requiring an automatic recount. Now, there may be some recounts. I'm not saying that won't happen. Mm-hmm. I do anticipate, as I think everybody does, that there will be legal challenges. but those will have to work their way through the system, and they'll have to be based on something.
Right, and that's actually a very good distinction to remember and to know, and that is it was Florida's automatic recount that triggered everything. So Dan, here we are. There's voting going on in 6 states. Biden is up in 3. President Trump is up in 3. What are the pathways for each candidate to get to 270?
Well, if the president holds Georgia and North Carolina, then he would need one of those northern states, and Pennsylvania would be the most attractive one for him because it's got the biggest number of electoral votes. It's got 20 electoral votes. For Biden, if he can hold on to Arizona, that gives him a little breathing room up north. Without Arizona, he would have to win all 3 of those northern states. Without it, I believe he could win simply Michigan and Wisconsin. And if he adds in the congressional districts, 1 congressional district each in Maine and in Nebraska, then I believe that comes out to 271 to 267 in favor of the former vice president. Again, that also means he has to hold Nevada, which is pretty close at this point.
Let me ask you something about the Senate, because also going into election night, there are quite a few Senate seats that look like, they were done for. I'm thinking Susan Collins. I'm thinking Joni Ernst, given that really bad debate performance that she had. And yet Joni Ernst won. I haven't been able to catch up to see how well Susan Collins is doing, but the fact that I'm still wondering this question and that race hadn't been decided last night, at least says something to me. What's going on with the Senate, do you think?
Well, it doesn't look as though the Democrats are going to be able to win the Senate. There are a number of seats that they have not, that have been declared, or certainly pretty close to it. And so I think their hopes for winning the Senate are gone at this point. The last I looked, which was actually a number of hours ago at the Collins race in Maine, she had a lead, but there was a lot of vote still out there. So I don't know what to say about that. Frankly, the Iowa seat, the Joni Ernst seat, over the weekend, there were indications that she was in much better shape than she had appeared to be prior to that. And a number of Republicans that I had talked to over the weekend were feeling much better about that race. North Carolina, it doesn't look as though Cunningham's going to be able to prevail over Tom Tillis. That was one that the Democrats saw as, a key seat. They picked up Colorado, the Democrats did. They picked up Arizona. But they're falling short in that. I mean, I think one of the things we saw yesterday and overnight is that there was a strong Republican turnout, and clearly the president's final couple of weeks of campaigning energized enough people to affect some of those races, or so it would appear.
Dan, sure, Democrats were hoping that they could do a full sweep and take over all of Washington, the House, the Senate, and the White House. One of the reasons for that was the poll numbers. Another reason was it would make getting longed for legislation pass. But now that Democrats are maintaining control of the House, Republicans are most likely going to retain control of the Senate. No matter who the president is come January 20th, their legislative agenda is going to be pretty much jammed up, right?
Well, if Biden ends up as the winner of this and he's facing a Republican Senate, he's going to have a great deal of difficulty. And I think that what the president has done with what he had to say overnight about this being fraud and it being stolen and that sort of thing is going to harden the attitudes of people on both sides. And so the prospect of any kind of real compromise is going to become much more difficult. So, I mean, we're in a constitutional, crisis at this point over what happens with this election, given what the president said, and we're also heading toward a period of continued dysfunctional government and a country even more divided than it was going into this election, if that is possible.
Dan, we are out of time, but as always, thank you very much for starting your day here. Well, you didn't really start your day here because it is 9 o'clock, but thank you for coming to First Look.
Thank you, Jonathan.
All right, let's go to the opinion side of the Washington Post and go to Deputy Editorial Page Editor Ruth Marcus and the very chatty contributing columnist Hugh Hewitt. I don't know if anyone else can hear him. I can hear him in my earpiece. Ruth, Hugh, good morning. All right, so Hugh, so I take it since I can't see you, we've got you by phone.
Arguing about putting me in the 3 box, which I think is like the timeout zone in hockey.
well, fine. Since we can see Ruth. Oh, there you are, Hugh. There you are. So, Ruth, since you are the steady cam right now, just give me your thoughts on what we went through last night, what we're going through now, and where do you see things going as the day progresses?
We don't know the outcome, and we may not get outcome today and tomorrow. I thought what Dan said last night was, and Dan Balz talked about it in his judicious way. I am an opinion columnist, so I don't need to be judicious. The president is trying to subvert our democracy. The votes are in, votes need to be counted. It makes perfect sense that given how close this race has to be, that it's going to take some time to count votes, to declare prematurely a win, to try to rouse up your followers to threaten to go to the Supreme Court when you can't go directly, as Dan said, and when you don't know what you would be going to the Supreme Court about is, Dan used the phrase constitutional crisis. I might even take it a step further. We're on the brink of a democracy crisis right now. And people like my good friend Hugh need to speak up for regular process, respecting the will of the voters, whatever that turns out to be.
Hugh, let me get you to react to what Ruth said. I mean, doesn't she have a point that what the president did last night was, subverting our democracy, declaring victory where there was none?
No, I don't think so. I think the president at 2:30 in the morning said pretty much what Joe Biden said, which is he's going to fight this every way that he can, every step that he can. My take this morning, I just finished a 3-hour radio show. The president has an uphill battle. He can win outright by holding Georgia, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. He can win Michigan, where he's ahead, but he has absentees to come in. He can flip Nevada.
Well, not anymore.
Arizona.
CNN is reporting that Vice President Biden is ahead in Michigan. But go on, Hugh.
But I'm talking about flipping it. Send lawyers, not guns and money, to Nevada, Arizona, Michigan, and flip one of them, and he wins outright. I believe that the rule of law will be followed. I believe that last night might have been overheated rhetoric. If I had been Joe Biden, I wouldn't have gone. If I'd been Donald Trump, I wouldn't have gone. I would have done the Al Gore and George W. Bush thing from 2000. But what's clear to me is that we will have a legal process that will result in a final determination by the time the Electoral College meets. And it's also pretty clear to me that the Senate is going to be in Republican hands. And as Dan Balz was saying, dysfunction to me, it's actually checks and balances. Half of the 4 branches, the executive, the Supreme Court, and the 2 houses of Congress will be Republican, half will be Democrat if Vice President Biden holds on. But I don't think we're in a crisis. I think the president typically goes big with his rhetoric. I thought Joe Biden was a little over the top myself last night, but I don't think it's supporting democracy. I don't think we have to be in panic mode. It's going to work out.
Ruth, what I'm hearing Hugh say right now is the exact same thing I heard Gary Abernathy say when we were on PBS earlier this morning after the president spoke. What's the big deal? It's just the president. This is how he talks. To your mind, is it acceptable that the president of the United States is telling the country he won a race he has not won?
It's 100% not acceptable, and I could not disagree with Hugh more that the comments from Vice President Biden and from President Trump are anything like one another. Vice President Biden said, we're going to count every vote. We're going to be in this till all the votes are counted. We don't know the outcome yet. The president said precisely the opposite. I've won. It's my understanding I've won. He didn't use the word rape last night, I don't think, but we're going to take it straight to the Supreme Court. He is riling up at a time when he should not that we can expect this from him ever, but he is riling up at a time when he should ask people to respect the outcome of the election, whatever it turns out to be. That is not Trump. That is not what he's doing. But to suggest that they're equally culpable is just flat out wrong, in my view.
I don't think anyone is culpable of anything. I just want to be clear so that I'm not misunderstood. I think everyone is electioneering. Everyone is positioning for a long, drawn-out battle of recount in Nevada, Arizona. By the way, there's 700,000 votes not counted in Arizona yet that were same-day votes that have to come in. There's a lot of votes in Nevada that have to come in. They're all positioning, and they're not riling up their base. They're riling up their money-generating, lawyer-sending loyalists to go to all of these states and do Florida 2020. I don't think, and after the display of blatant bias in the polls, I believe the left has got to be very careful about accusing the right of manipulation because those polls were so wrong. Wisconsin was passed as a double-digit loss for Donald Trump, its margin of error. The same was true about the national poll. I think the one thing Admiral Stavridis told me this morning, if the pollsters in the United States were intelligence officers in the United States military, they'd all be fired. And so we are at this position because of what the left would call is voter suppression, bad information propagated by a media that is overwhelmingly liberal to left that did not honestly project to the American people what the margin was in this. There was no blue wave. There was no red wave. We will get through it. It will be rule of law. And I just do not attach, as Ruth does, significance to remarks at 2:30 in the morning in the White House. He didn't say go to the barricade. Come on, people. It's just electioneering talk. It's rhetoric.
Okay. Go ahead, Ruth. Say that again, Ruth.
Presidential rhetoric, whatever time it's delivered in the heat of an election this close, matters a lot. And there is a difference between a president saying that cast votes should not be counted and pollsters, frankly, screwing up in the job that they were supposed to do. They're not the same.
Right. And Ruth, I was going to ask you this question because you are a lawyer. Hugh, I don't know if you were a lawyer, but I know Ruth is a lawyer. And
Okay,
I've actually argued before the Ninth Circuit.
Okay. So
Hugh is I've been beating up on Hugh this morning, so let me just say he is much more of a lawyer than I am.
That's not true. We're both good lawyers.
Okay, so then this makes this conversation even more interesting, counselors. So let's talk about the Supreme Court, because the President of the United States said to the nation that he's going to the Supreme Court. Dan Balz just a moment ago said that that's not how this works. He can't go directly to the Supreme Court. And when I asked him, well, how does this compare to 2000? He reminded me that the Supreme Court got involved because of the trigger of the automatic recount in Florida. So put me in the mind of the president as best you can, how you get from an election night where the votes are still being counted to I'm going right to the Supreme Court.
You want me to go first?
Let Ruth go first, then you, Hugh.
So to me, the most likely scenario for a legitimate Supreme Court challenge involves Pennsylvania. If Pennsylvania is the Florida of 2020, so that its action is dispositive, and you have to have, as Hugh knows, a case in controversy to go to the Supreme Court. There is one that's live, which is if Pennsylvania is very close and it's affected by the extension of that was granted by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court of a 3-day window for late arriving ballots, as long as they're postmarked by Election Day. If they arrive within 3 days, they'll be counted. If those ballots make the margin of difference, there is a legitimate argument to be had about whether the Pennsylvania Supreme Court overstepped the federal constitutional boundaries. The federal constitution says that the rules of the election are written by the state legislature, subject to congressional oversight. The state legislature didn't extend the deadline, and the state Supreme Court did. You can see that case ending up in the Supreme Court, and that could be in the Supreme Court of a very potentially winning case for President Trump and Republicans. How'd I do?
Wait, expand on that, and then we get to go to Hugh for the counter. Why would it be a potential victory for President Trump? Just because of the makeup of the court?
if the late arriving ballots, the ballots that arrive within this state Supreme Court created 3-day extension, are disqualified, which would be pretty outrageous given that voters in Pennsylvania were told they had these 3 extra days. But if those ballots were disqualified and that made the margin of difference in Pennsylvania, and therefore it was determined effectively that President Trump won Pennsylvania and not by Vice President Biden, that could make all the difference in the world. I don't think that's a likely scenario, for one thing, and I should have mentioned this earlier. The Supreme Court's going to be really reluctant, having decided not to disturb those Pennsylvania rules, to come in afterwards and say, only kidding, your ballots are getting thrown out after all. But that's the biggest litigation risk, it seems to me.
Okay. I think I'm following. Hugh.
I think Ruth correctly characterized the litigation that is live and already at the Supreme Court. So that's where we would correct our friend Dan Balz on whether or not there's a live controversy. There is a live controversy, but I don't think that's what's going to happen. If the president is going to prevail, I think he will win Pennsylvania. Judging by what I understand of the Western Pennsylvania vote, the absentees, I don't think it will come down to those ballots about which there's a live controversy. I think it will come down to litigation in Nevada and possibly in Michigan. And if it does, it will be over for example, they changed the standard this week about legibility of signatures in Nevada. And Adam Laxalt will lead the charge, former Attorney General of Nevada. And a case in controversy will arise, as it did in Florida, over a period of time involving the Ninth Circuit as opposed to I guess it was the 11th Circuit back then, and the Nevada Supreme Court, the makeup of which I do not know. And they will go back and forth on whether or not there's a live controversy if the president holds on in North Carolina, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. I think it's going to be Nevada or Michigan, and there's plenty of time for a fully developed record. What I understood the president to say last night is he's going to take every advantage in every lawsuit that he can, and that he will, as he has at every step of the way, abide by the final ruling of the Supreme Court. Right now, the most important op-ed in the United States was published by the Washington Post a week ago by former Fourth Circuit Judge Mike Luttig on whether or not Amy Coney Barrett would be obliged to recuse herself in any of this litigation. I personally do not believe that she is. Judge Luttig did not decide, though Ruth, I believe, read that as saying, she's got to recuse. There are 20 different ways to get to the Supreme Court. We're just going to have to be patient.
Ruth?
Judge Luttig, I edited that op-ed, so I can speak to it. Luttig said she might not be obliged, but prudence might well counsel her to recuse herself in that circumstance. I think prudence would definitely counsel that, but we shall see if that happens.
How much confidence do you have that she would indeed recuse herself?
Very little.
We agree again.
Oh my God.
Ruth and I are agreeing on everything except the appropriateness of the president's remarks. We're all in agreement.
Can I make one quick?
Absolutely.
One quick point? I think if things go the way I fervently hope they go, and that Vice President Biden is elected president, and we get through this thing, I think I'm not overblown in calling it a democracy crisis. I think that one of the things, and this goes to the Supreme Court conversation that we've been having, that's really important to understand, is we're going to have a president that's not only hemmed in by a Supreme Court, not only hemmed in by a Senate that is going to seek to frustrate his will at every moment and frustrate his efforts at any moment, but is going to be hemmed in at the same time by a conservative dominated Supreme Court that I imagine is not going to have this sort of view of the powerful unitary executive when the unitary executive is President Biden, that it might have had about a previous president. And so he is going to have, if he gets there, and I really hope he does, President Biden, a very uphill struggle in terms of governing this very divided country.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, Ruth, because wait 1 second. I'm glad you brought that up because I've been thinking about that as well. The fact that Democrats have the House, Republicans are going to retain control of the Senate. And no matter who the president is come January 20th, their legislative agenda is going to be frustrated even more so if that president is President Biden. Can anything get done in Washington in the next 4 years, given the political makeup of this town?
Well, if you were going to shake up the government to a divided government, this is the best way to get something done, with Leader McConnell negotiating with Vice President Biden and now President-elect Biden or President Biden to arrange a grand bargain. Because if Mitch necessarily has to do so, he won't approve a single judge. I mean, he will not. He will blockade again. He will use the rule. And if they adopt the Chuck Schumer tactics of the last 4 years, President's 3,000 appointees will become 1,000 appointees. And if they adopt the tactics of the last 4 years, there'll be a special counsel appointed as soon as the vice president is the president-elect under Rule 600.1 of the CFR, applicable to special counsels to investigate whether or not there are circumstances that cause the president to be, the new president, to be questioned as to their involvement with past illegal actions by Hunter Biden. We're in for a replay, the reverse negative of the last 4 years. Stalled appointments, blocked Supreme Court justices, attempts to get promises out of nominees. But you know what? Leader McConnell is much more reasonable than Leader Schumer. And I believe that what we'll see, the potential, something I wrote about for Ruth that she edited years ago, a grand bargain. Can we get the courts back to normal? Can we please return the courts to, if you're qualified, you get on. If you're a Democrat, if you're a Republican, they'd have to give the Republicans a few judges to make up for the blocks in California. But there's a deal to be done. I'm actually kind of optimistic if it breaks down Vice President Biden or President-elect Biden and Leader McConnell, that stuff will get done. But there's not going to be a Green New Deal. There is going to be a reversal of the Chevron doctrine, which Ruth can expound on if she really wants to bore us to death. But I mean, if we want to get into the weeds, we can get into the weeds, because the Chevron rule is my whole life. I love the Chevron rule, but I'm not going to do what Ruth has to do. It's going to be.
We've talked about the Chevron rule in editorial board meetings, and I still have no idea what it's about. Finish your thought, Hugh, and then we'll close out with Ruth.
I'm looking forward to the next 3 months, and at the end of it, we will inaugurate a president, whether it is Vice President Biden or President Trump, and we'll all agree that that's the president, because this is America. We're not going to the barricades. There will be some tough speeches. Everything will be fine.
From your lips to God's ears on that one, Hugh. Ruth?
Whatever happens, I am dreading the next 3 months, because I am dreading what this president proved his irresponsibility again last night at a very critical moment. What he would do in the interim, I would very much dread another 4 years of President Trump. But I thought Hugh's description of this elusive grand bargain between Senate Majority Leader McConnell and at this moment imaginary President Trump just underscores how ugly and divisive this stretch is going to be, no matter who's elected president. And if anybody wants to know about the Chevron doctrine, call me and I'll walk you through it.
Can you do it in 3 sentences? What is this? Really? I mean, we have a little bit of time, not a lot.
Okay.
But what is it in 2 sentences?
The Chevron doctrine says that when there's a reasonable interpretation of a statute, that the agency that's entrusted with interpreting the statute gets to have its way, and the courts should defer to that. When courts start second guessing, say, agencies under President Biden that might be assertive in their interpretation of the law, then regulations get struck down. And regulations could easily get struck down by this conservative court. That's why the Chevron doctrine actually matters, because it matters for all sorts of environmental rules that Hugh and I both care a lot about from different points of view. It matters for issues relating to the Affordable Care Act, and it matters for the whole apparatus of the regulatory state.
And if I'm following along, if I'm following the bouncing ball along, it really is key to holding the foundation of our democracy together.
You want me to say that? No. We want Chevron gone. We want legislators to legislate. We do not want bureaucrats to rule. We want private property, when it is temporarily taken by a regulation, to be compensated by the Supreme Court. So I hate the Chevron doctrine. I want Congress to do its job. But
it's not.
We don't know what's going to happen.
I'm so sorry I went down this route. Go on, Ruth.
About how much leeway regulatory agencies are going to have in the next administration. And this is a Supreme Court that has many conservatives aboard that really want to rein in various ways the ability of agencies to do their job in interpreting and enforcing statutes.
Jonathan,
right,
one
yes.
more thing.
Sure, Hugh.
We're not going to expand the Supreme Court. We're not going to pack the Supreme Court. That is dead, dead, dead. And that is great for the democracy and the republic.
I wish we had more time to keep going down these rabbit holes that you keep digging, Hugh, in answers to questions, but we can't. I'm just going to ask you each a yes or no question. Will we have a president, a designated winner in time for the inauguration, or should we get ready for a President Pelosi? Hugh first.
Yes, we will have a president by the rule of law that will be accepted by 80% to 90% of the country.
Ruth.
Yes, probably, but a president who spoke the way the president did last night could also have the Pennsylvania state legislature, if it comes to that, send competing slates of electors, and it could be one huge stinking mess.
So that means we could have a President Pelosi if we get this all next up. We can talk about that in another show. We are out of time. Hugh Hewitt, Ruth Marcus, as always, thank you very much for coming on First Look.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Ruth.
And thank you, as always, for watching. Washington Post Live will be back at 1 p.m. Eastern today for Election Daily with Bob Costa, continuing our coverage of this election season. He'll be in conversation with former White House counsel Don McGahn, Maryland Governor Larry Hogan, and Biden campaign advisor Bob Bauer. That's going to be a very important discussion given where we are right now. Once again, I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Thank you for joining Washington Post Live.